Regulate Tech. This is our first episode of 2023. Ta-da-da-da!
Happy New Year!
Happy
Late,
New
late,
Year.
late.
Yes,
Happy
very
New
late.
Year.
We're
February.
kind of lazy, I think.
Yeah.
Yes. So, this episode, we would return to one of our old favorite subjects, which is the online safety bill. And there's a new one every time we talk, it seems.
Yeah.
And this time around, it's coming very close to its final shape, perhaps, and there are changes in it that are quite interesting. Talk a little bit about what is the process that leads to these, because they're quite big changes that we're seeing.
They are. So there's a kind of the gestation process of a piece of legislation can be longer than the gestation of an elephant. It can take years, and
Yes.
this one I think is.
And the elephant is cuter in the end.
And they are cute, yeah. So we're literally, I think now at 5 years that the sort of process has been running of thinking about this. And then what happened was we there's a process where the government puts forward ideas. They then gave us the first version of the bill. The first version of the bill went to a joint committee of both houses of the UK Parliament. Today I think we'll get a little bit into parliamentary procedure. So some members of the House of Lords, the unelected second chamber, and some members of the House of Commons, the elected first chamber, got together, looked at the bill, produced, I think, a very good report, a reasonable report saying, you know, we like these pieces of it, we don't like those pieces of it. And so the bill was revised again on the basis of that feedback. It then went into the House of Commons, and the House of Commons did its thing. And for the thing to become law in the UK, it has to have been through both houses. So
Yeah.
process of going through the House of Commons, lots of different stages, and then process of going through the House of Lords. As it got near to finishing its process in the House of Commons, we had, I think, two changes of Prime Minister. We had one, this Liz Truss came in and she didn't last very long and then she went out again. But sort of through that process of turmoil in the governing party, it became clear that they wanted to rethink some aspects of the bill.
Why? Let's dig into that a bit. What was it? Outside pressure? Was it a fundamental difference of ideology? Was it a changing of the times from when the process started to when the government looked at it again? Had the world changed enough for them to rethink it? What's your best guess?
I mean, the bill, I think, is not a free expression bill. The bill is about limiting what people in the United Kingdom can see on the internet. That's its primary purpose. It's about limiting expression. Yeah. But the government, we're trying to portray it as on the one hand, on the other. And so on the one hand, it limits expression, but on the other hand, there's a load of free expression stuff in there. I actually think that's misleading. I think it's like 3 steps forward towards restricting expression and like half a step back at best. But the political will was to say we want it to be more free expression. That was the sort of political shift in the ruling Conservative parties thinking.
It seems to be influenced a bit by the discussion you can see, for example, in the US, where there's a worry that platforms are stifling speech, perhaps from the Conservative side. But that's not the debate we had in the UK.
No, I think it's different. And the US, I mean, again, really interesting. I think the idea of pro-free speech legislation is an oxymoron. It doesn't exist. And the framers of the US First Amendment got it right. They said Congress shall make no laws. So if you believe in you're maximalist in free expression, you should not want any laws in this space at all, because all laws tend to limit expression. If you don't want to limit it, you don't make a law. And there's just like a tendency to go in that direction. Now, in the European tradition, we are more comfortable with laws that limit expression. But what you had with the Conservative Party is, you know, they were putting forward a law that was going to limit expression. In the sense, they got cold feet and they kind of went, let's row it back a bit. So the most visible thing that they did was version 2 of the bill. Version 1 was the one that went to the Joint Committee. Version 2 was the one that went to the House of Commons. It had some provisions in it which said that the regulator would be responsible for making sure that online platforms did certain things around content that was not illegal. That's a double negative. But and what they did was to say, look, we're going to take that out, and we're going to say that, you know, the regulator's toughest powers are restricted to making sure that platforms do certain things with content that is illegal in the United Kingdom.
And that's we have debated this before, the formulation of legal but
harmful, which is a horrible framing, and people say like it was never in the bill, but it was basically saying, you know, the regulator takes upon themselves this ability to kind of tell you what to do about stuff that is not illegal. And now in the latest version, it says, look, the regulator can tell you what to do, about stuff that is not illegal if it's deemed to be harmful to children. But if it's not illegal and the complaint is that it's harmful to an adult, the regulator can't order you to do anything with that content. That content should be dealt with under your terms of service, but you are free as a platform to be more or less restrictive or permissive for anything that is not illegal. And what the regulator can do is make sure you enforce your terms, but not tell you what they should be. So that's the rowing back. It's sort of, I say, if the old bill was 4 steps forward, quarter of a step back, we're now 3 steps forward, half a step back. That's the change that they really felt they needed to make.
One of the things we like to do is to think about the harms and to really think. And there seems to be 2 interesting theories of harm here. One is that harm and illegality should be defined as the same thing. That seems to be one theory, right? Yeah. And the other theory is that, but there are harms that can be defined by platforms in their terms of services. And if they define something as a harm according to their terms of services, they should be held to consistently apply that standard as well. So there's a privately defined harm, if you will, and then a publicly defined harm. Is that what's happening here?
Yeah, it is. I mean, honestly, I think if we take a step back, like just zoom right out here, what's happening is that Parliament is taking to itself the power to tell online platforms, tens of thousands of them, how they should run their business and how they should regulate speech as exposed to people in the United Kingdom. I mean, like, this is like a dramatic shift. We're writing ourselves in thousands of pages of law. We're writing ourselves this ability to say to the platform, like, this is what you've got to do in terms of making speech available to people in the UK or restricting it. And if you don't do that, you can't operate in the UK market. And if you try and resist, we can fine the hell out of you and we can even put you in prison. I'm sure we'll get to that.
Yes, that seems to be another big deal.
But that's pretty dramatic. So it's like, basically, once this is in law, you have to pay up, because you're going to have to pay for the privilege of being regulated. So you're going to have to give our regulator money and you're going to have to follow all their instructions or get out of the UK market. That's dramatic.
Yes.
And so what we're really arguing about then is what's the scope of that set of instructions that the regulator can give to them, and under what terms and what are the sanctions if they fail to meet them. And what we've said, and the way I'd sort of characterize this is, there's a saying, I think, from the Gnostic Gospels, which is Jesus was asked about something to do with the Roman Empire, and he said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and unto God that which is God's. And so we sort of ended up with that to say, in this
who
model,
is Caesar and who is God here?
Caesar is the person who runs the platform, the worldly manager of the platform.
Right.
God is Parliament and the British government.
So
God ultimately has the authority. We could tell them whatever. We can set the law, and that's also extraordinary for me, that there's this whole thing of platforms are so powerful and we're so weak. Actually, no. I mean, we can write whatever we want in the law. We can say you must make all your websites green if we like, or you must put everything item that begins with an F at the top of your newsfeed. We can write anything into this law. It's Parliament sovereign. And so what we're doing is deciding what is Caesar's and what is God's. And we've said, look, for stuff that's illegal, that's God's. We lay down the law. We can tell you exactly what to do, and we can really come after you if you don't deal with it. Beyond that, except for children, we'll talk about that exception, but certainly for adult stuff, we're saying we're leaving that to Caesar. Having done that, I was in the debate yesterday for hours and hours and hours in the House of Lords, and you can already sense a lot of nervousness and a lot of people wanting to row back and go back to where they were before, because they're saying, does that really mean that lots of awful speech that we hate could be allowed by a platform if they want to, and there's nothing we can do? And the answer is, well, if their terms say it's okay, it's okay. Or what about all that misinformation?
Unless you make it illegal later on, because you have the power to do that.
Which again, and I've argued why we should never expect the law to be coterminous with what's unacceptable in a free society. And again, the example I'd use, look, if I go into any public space, if we walk out of here now and go into a bar, there's lots of things that we can't say.
Yes.
We can't shout racist speech or say that we want to, women or whatever, or hand out Nazi pamphlets without getting thrown out. And I think that's how, pretty much how online platforms work. There are some way you can do all of that stuff.
Civil society norms in
Exactly.
addition to the laws. Right?
Exactly. So that civil society norm stuff is for the platforms to do. But I can hear some sort of colleagues in Parliament already getting nervous and going, but the bad place will still exist. Well, they will. Just like in the real world, there are some pubs you can go to where, people will say racist things and they're pretty bad. But most people don't go to those places most of the time. But I can hear some people getting nervous. But you've got to jump one way or the other.
And so it's interesting if you look at the different iterations of the online safety bill and you try to predict how much content would be in scope of the regulation, would you say that it's radically less, radically more over the different iterations?
So I don't think it is, and here's the other thing that I'm sure you've experienced this. I think there's like a popular misconception, particularly amongst policymakers actually, that it's clear what's legal and what's illegal. And in the real world it's not. So if you take an area like hate speech, in the UK there is a very narrow subset of hate speech that would be illegal in the sense that, look, if someone complained and this went to court, a judge looking at all the circumstances might say you've broken the law. Like, that's how we define illegality. Until you've been to court and a judge has ruled, you don't know. So as a platform, you see some speech and all you can do is you can send it to a lawyer and the lawyer will say, it's probably illegal, or it's quite likely illegal, or it's always going to be qualified with some judgment. So when you're dealing with something like hate speech, you're dealing with it as a class of content of which a subset may be illegal. And so again, in practice, when you're trying to comply with the online safety bill, even though the law says technically, look, you're only in trouble if you fail to remove the illegal stuff, in practice, you're going to be looking at all hate speech or all terrorist content. Again, somebody starts praising a terrorist organisation, at what point does that cross the line? We have a law in the UK about praising terrorist organisations, but it's quite tightly defined, quite rightly again, because we believe in freedom of expression. So I think for most classes of content, the practical effect of this change is very small. But what it does mean from a risk point of view from the platform is that their risk is slightly narrowed, because their legal risk only kicks in if they can be proved to have failed over the illegal stuff. There's a different risk if they're proved to be not enforcing their own terms of service. But again, in reality, as I say, the terms of service are going to be much wider than the narrow set of illegal terrorism or hate speech or whatever we're talking about. They're going to be more broadly drawn. And so platforms in practice are going to be removing a much broader range of content. They do today. Yes. And there's no reason to think that they'll stop doing it in future.
And it seems to me that going back to, say, circa 2006, 2007, platforms that were around at that time spent a lot of time trying to determine those fine nuances of the law. Is this really X or is it not X? And they had a lot of very thoughtful people who sort of spent an inordinate amount of time trying to figure this stuff out and then render some kind of judgment and build almost what resembled internal case law. Over time, I think platforms have wearied of this and they've adopted broader and broader standards saying that, why don't we take it down instead of spending cycles on it, because there's some reputational harm and it does create some legal risk. And so if you think about the way that the online safety bill is shaped now, it's very likely that the corona of stuff that will be taken down outside of the actually illegal content is actually going to be quite large as compared both to earlier times and compared to no online safety bill, right?
Yeah, I think, and again, I personally think this is quite smart to say Caesar and God, to make that distinction, because I think from a sort of constitutional point of view, I think there should be a distinction if a government has made something illegal about how their regulator treats that versus something that's not. But as I say, in practice, you're absolutely right that as platforms sort of become bigger, become public companies, try and attract commercial business, they, I think, inevitably end up restricting far more speech than that which is narrowly illegal. It's because the community wants it. Just in the same way that if I run a reputable pub or a restaurant, I'm not going to, allow all sorts of behaviour that perhaps a small disreputable pub or restaurant would allow. It's something about being mainstream that allows that. Now, some of the opponents of the way in which the bill works, or the fears that they had, is that they feared that the effect of the legislation would be to make this even broader still. And I think actually where we've ended up, it's going to be very little change in terms of, I can't see platforms making their terms of service broader, or restrictions under the terms of service broader than they are today. I think they'll catch illegal and then, as you described it, a corona of other stuff. But there's no reason for them to go further. I think there was a risk with the last version of the bill that they would. So now, as long as they've got the illegal stuff, that they've got to be 95% good on the illegal stuff, or 98%. And then on the broader span of stuff that's prohibited under their terms, they still need to be pretty good, because the government's saying they've got to do what they said they did, but they're not going to be quite at the same level of legal risk if they screw up on that, so they can afford to be, a little bit less strict. I think in the last version of the bill, if the regulator was going to be equally strict on all of this other stuff, then perhaps they'd have to go a little bit broader again. So this allows them to stay where they are today in terms of overall restrictions. Same amount of hate speech, same amount of terrorist content as today will probably come down. And that will capture all the illegal stuff that they're really worried about, and the terms of service stuff where they do need to do it, but they're under a little bit less jeopardy.
So we coming back to the question, we think that at one point in the evolution of the bill, the corona content was actually quite big, but it's shrunk a little bit and gone back to, if you ex ante, so before the bill and when the bill comes into force, what's the delta then between the scope, do you think?
I don't think there's much of a delta. I think actually what platforms will have to do is they'll have to much more tightly define their terms of service, because now again, if in the world before you were unhappy, you thought that the platform was not doing what it said it would do, there was very little you could do. No, you had to go and challenge the platform directly, but that's difficult. Post the bill, once it's in force, if you think the platform is not enforcing its own terms, you can go and make a complaint to the regulator, Ofcom. And Ofcom will not say what it thinks the term should be, but it will look at whether or not they've been enforced. So if I was working at a platform today, I would want to go and check what we're actually doing and what our terms say, and make sure that there's very close alignment. And I think, again, you and I have experienced this, sometimes the practice and what's written in the terms have got out of kilter. And they do, and there's a delta for a while. Now they have to make sure that the terms are really quite specific and precise, and that if there is a complaint, they can demonstrate to Ofcom that what was in their terms is what they actually did.
So it changes the nature and function of the terms of service a little bit. Because the terms of service, when they were drafted originally, way back when, in the early 2000s, they were largely put in place in an American spirit, which was, we want to have this so we have the ability to remove stuff we don't like. Very broadly written, very sort of generous application for the part of the platform. But what you're saying now is that a part of the negotiation of social safety that goes beyond what is actually illegal is going to be, the site for that is going to be the terms of service. So if you're an activist and there's something you really don't like, it now makes sense, rather than to go say change the law, to lobby the platform to change its terms of service. Yeah,
potentially that's the way it goes. And it does import, in a sense, a concept from American law. So in the US, one of the reasons why you and I might have experienced it was very hard sometimes to make public commitments about anything is that the Federal Trade Commission in the United States, which is a very powerful regulator, has this notion of unfair and deceptive practices. Quite broad, which says, look, if a platform makes a public commitment, or any product, actually, it's not about platforms, it's any product. You say, my soap powder washes whiter than white, and if your soap powder does not wash whiter than white, someone can argue that was unfair and deceptive. They bought the product on a misleading information. And so that actually, I think, drove a lot of platforms in the US to make as few commitments as possible because they were worried about being held to them. And I've had that view when we're trying to sign up to European codes of practice, and the lawyers would look at it and go, "Oh, you can't sign up to that because it would
actually have legal force in the US.
In the US,
whereas in Europe it would be soft law or
exactly. But I think in a sense, we're sort of importing that concept now into the UK model, where there is a regulator, so Ofcom will act like the FTC in the US, in the sense that if somebody thinks that the platform's not conforming to its own terms of service, they've got a regulator to go to now and effectively argue that it was unfair and deceptive. It didn't work as they said it would work.
So here's a question for you. Doesn't that actually provide an incentive for the platform to look at their terms and services and say, ooh, there's so much in there that we put in there over the years. Let's take all of that out and be very restrictive in what we remove and have a very minimum that we think corresponds to the economic value of the platform and nothing else.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, but then there's a whole bunch of other stuff in the bill. And remember, this is a very long bill with a lot of clauses where they will have to put a whole load of stuff in. So it's got, for example, particular protections around content of public significance, so journalists, political content, and so on. So when the lawyers sit down and read through this bill, and by the way, just to flag again something we called out early on, that there was an impact assessment. I think I had some ludicrously low figures for how much cost it would be for people to do a legal review of the online safety bill and become compliant. Like, this is going to cost a lot of money.
One legal intern 1 month.
It was like, this is like, so they, teams of lawyers are going to work on this for months and months to figure out what to do. I think at the end of it, they will effectively have to rewrite their terms for the UK, and they're probably going to have to do something similar for Digital Services Act in the EU. And one of the big questions is whether the rewrite in one country is going to also be acceptable in another country, or we end up with like hugely varied terms for every country depending on what they need.
The incentive seems to be otherwise. But that was another question I had for you. Looking at the current version of the online service bill and then looking at the DSA, what's the delta between the regulated content?
Yeah, so they cover some. They're quite similar, but the DSA, in a sense, actually is less tightly defined. So the online safety bill is much more clear and specific about what it's going after. So, for example, it has a list of priority UK offences that are the main thing to go after, and it can do that because in the EU, as we've experienced, speech laws differ hugely. I don't know how the DSA is going to work. It's like there is stuff that it is absolutely strictly illegal to say in Germany. You cross the border to the Netherlands, and that's absolutely protected speech. And how dare anyone interfere with it?
And then if you go to the Nordics, there's almost nothing you can't burn.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, they're going to have fun with theirs, but because the UK one is single country only, they can be much more specific about these are the things you've got to watch out for. So I think the UK one is quite tightly defined. It covers a lot of the same areas. Some areas actually it doesn't cover that I think the EU is aiming at. So things like mis and disinformation actually are not in the UK law. They're not interested in that. I mean, people are interested, and there may be amendments, but it's not there today. At the moment, it's very sort of tightly defined around sort of child safety, kind of offences against the person, and then a few areas like fraud. So fraud would be covered, financial fraud, but not sort of misinformation, stuff like that.
So in this case, the UK delivers on actually covering less content and being a clearer regulation than what the European Union is. The sort of this idea that the UK regulation would be significantly different from European Union legislation seems to be true.
It is, yeah. They've gone in a different direction, so it's really quite clear and quite precise. Actually, the one that it's closer to than I think the DSA is the German Network Enforcement Act. So it's got something similar to that. The Network Enforcement Act had a whole list of things that are illegal and said this is how you must deal with those things. So if there is an origin, it's closer to the Network Enforcement Act. The DSA in a sense I think sort of goes wider and is a little bit more diffuse, shall we say. I mean, it's still shaping up. The European Commission's got their hands on it and they're trying to work out what to do with it at the moment. I think they're working through that process now. But yeah, because it's in a single country, it can just list, single pieces of illegal speech and say, that's what we want you to deal with.
Yeah. And so, again, assume you were back advising the platform. Wouldn't you just tell them to run with the DSA? Because if you get the DSA right, you'll cover the online safety bill automatically.
Yeah, I don't think so. And I think it's the dynamic. It's really interesting how this is going to play out now because, again, candidly, the Ofcom, I think, had a very good reputation globally as a leading telecoms regulator. And a lot of what was happening in European telecoms regulation, Ofcom would quite often be the lead, and so you do it first with Ofcom, and then you kind of roll it over into other regulators within the EU because I think it was seen as a more sort of dynamic, forward-looking market. Now that dynamic's broken, it's quite interesting to see because I think in some ways that the sort of nitty-gritty, it'll be easier for the companies to kind of get to grips with what they have to do to comply in the UK. I mean, there's also a reason English language and the fact that a lot of the companies are American run, and is a significant issue. The culture, Ofcom's going to have 300 people hired, a lot of whom come from the sector, whereas with the Commission, I think you'd be more dealing with more traditional civil servants, shall we say, of people who've worked. They'll hire externally as well, but I think the core are long-term public servants. It's a different culture that you have there.
Different labour law.
Different labour law, but So I think so. Had we still been in the EU and the DSA was covering the UK, probably you would have looked to do the UK compliance and then sort of roll that over. Now that link is broken. It's fascinating to see how that works out. So, but I do think the companies will have to do both. The Digital Services Act was sort of first out the blocks in terms of actually getting on the statute book, but I think the online safety bill in some ways will move faster once it's through.
So what are the traps here? Assume you're a platform, you have looked at all of your terms of services, you've looked at your practices, you've looked at transparency and accountability, you looked at all of those different things, and you're a large platform or a very large platform, and so you're complying with that according to the DSA, and you're like, that's it, I'm not going to have a look at this online safety bill. Where can you fall short if you just do that? So
I think the gatekeeping, so there's a really, really big focus on age assurance, verification, all of that sort of stuff, and there are a couple of things in there that are they've got a lot of focus, and I think on getting more focus, it goes through Parliament. Again, so just quick stock check on where we are. So it's gone through the House of Commons. Yeah. It goes through the House of Lords. The House of Lords, essentially in the British system, is the place where things get tidied up, because in the House of Commons, the government just defends its legislation and says no to everything, and the government has a majority. So even where people raise sensible changes, the government tends to go no. And then by the time it gets to the House of Lords, where the government doesn't have a majority, then there'll be a lot of tidying up. And some of that tidying up is stuff the government wants to do anyway, and some of that tidying up is sort of prompted by people outside the government. But there's a process now where they'll do that. And so you start to see the areas. The government has already signalled the areas where they want to get tough. And they've signalled where the priorities are. And one of them is this age assurance, age verification.
Let's talk about that, because that's another big change, the way that sort of children is, well, not a change, but it's sort of they've pushed even more on how children are singled out as an object of protection. Yeah. The harm to children is a significant concern. Right.
So there are various elements to it. So one is, the bill has much heavier requirements if your service is available to children. And they'll assume it is unless you use age verification to prove that you're 18 plus. So one question, and I think it's a genuine question for a service like Twitter, would be, if your audience is anyway 18 plus and you don't care about the youngsters, then you have an option to say, look, I'm going to make sure I'm 18 plus only. I'm going to I'm going to demonstrate to the regulator that I'm doing proper gatekeeping. And if I can do that, I don't need to do any of the kids' requirements. And that's actually makes my life a lot easier. So there's a business case, doing the kids' requirements versus losing under 18s.
But so what do you then do with the installed base? Because you have a number of UK users already.
Yeah, but you'd have to kick them off.
But how do you know? Do you kick
so you'd have to run everyone. You'd have to run.
So you'd have to kick every UK Twitter user, log in again, and then age.
You make them age verify in.
Force log them out, and then
get them to come in and do it. So that's sort of one question, and so there's that. If you want to think about the regulatory obligations, there is a real obsession with pornography, and that actually came up in the debate yesterday. Like a lot of it's very graphic. The record of the UK Parliament is called Hansard, and if you search the Hansard
Don't look
for the House of Lords, it wouldn't pass a lot of filtering systems because
not safe for work is safe for the House of Lords.
Yeah, exactly, and it's we have a tradition of getting quite graphic. So there was a lot of graphic conversation, but there's a genuine concern. But the porn thing sort of breaks down into a number of potential challenges. I think most people, including myself, will say, look, if you want to have an 18 plus verification for a thing that is, getyourpornhere.com, like a straightforward commercial porn website, that's pretty straightforward, and the porn providers, a lot of them will say that's okay. But here's the problem: they'll say that's okay as long as you make sure that everyone does it. Yeah. And then we get into two challenges. One challenge is, what about the mixed sites? And of the big social networks, most of them are porn free, but Twitter is not. And Twitter is actually the big sort of question. So if you're going to have a big know your customer age assurance gate at the front of getyourpornhere.com, everyone's fine. But it would be quite different to say, okay, you now need to have that before you can get onto a Twitter or a Reddit where there is some, adult content on it. And so there's a big question there about, is it porn dedicated sites only, or what about sites where you could access porn, but they're not porn sites? Big question there. And then the second one is blocking. Yes. Because, the big mainstream pornography providers, I'm sure, if they think everyone's doing it, they'll accept they do it. But they're going to be knocking on the government's door and saying, look, you've got to block all those sites that don't sign up. Yes. And that could be a lot of websites on the internet. So I think the concern is, yes, we put the serious age gating onto those getyourpornhere.com sites, but we don't want them people to be displaced to other sites that have some porn. That's the only place they can go and get it, or to sites that are just going, we're outside the UK, screw you, we're not going to comply. And so they need a fix for the Twitters and Reddits, and the fix could be some kind of gating, reliable gating if you want the porn content. So you go to normal Twitter, fine, there'll be whatever controls you have to access normal Twitter, but then there'll be another level of controls if inside Twitter or Reddit or wherever you want to get into the adult bit. And then somewhere in the network, and this is tough, and we've actually had a law on the UK statute book for a while called the Digital Economy Act that already said they should be insisting on age verification for porn sites, never got implemented. And I think one of the big challenges is the second piece, which is, how's it going to work if we have to tell all the UK internet service providers, here's a list of potentially thousands of IP addresses that they have to block.
Yes.
And there's been a bit of IP address blocking at the network level in the UK for things like Pirate Bay and stuff that we've discussed. But doing it at scale is a bit of an unknown for us. Normal for China, but not normal for the UK. And so I think just from a very practical point of view.
And it takes some curation too, because you can't just block a list and say done.
Yeah.
Because once you do that, the list changes.
And,
right?
And the porn's now being served from a bit of AWS, Amazon Web Services, that's got other stuff on it, or so it's reliably blocking internet sites at scale is hard, and it seems pretty unavoidable if we're assuming that we're going to have 10 or 20 or 30 big name commercial pornography providers, perfectly legal, now doing good know your customer checks and getting through to their adult user base, but we don't want underage just sort of roaming off, and they will, and they'll. I mean, it's always about putting friction in place. Like, you never get a perfect block.
But it's also like it's an interesting problem, because there's like an inverse motivation for young people to sometimes find out what this is because they're curious, and as you grow older you might become less curious about porn, and so it's a really hard problem because the circumvention incentives are very high.
They're very high, and so you want to put enough friction in place that, I mean, that's the whole point of the law, is to make it more frictionful.
Yeah.
I think there are some colleagues who think you can make it perfect. Hopefully, as we go through the bill, they'll realise it's not. It's just about what's the right level of friction. And so, the right level of friction for a gambling site today is a know your customer check and a credit card check and so on. And so you may end up with the right level of friction for a porn site being that. But what's the right level of friction for a general social network that has a bit of adult content in it?
I mean, this notion of its major purpose being is, of course, really difficult to...
Exactly. So I think we're going to go backwards and forwards on that.
Just as a tangential, is this also true for porn magazines in the UK, that you have to be 18 to buy them?
So you do. And so one of the examples actually I've used, because we like our real world examples, is the difference between a sex shop, and sex shops in the UK always were 18 only with a big sign over the door, and going to a general newsagent or bookshop where it has some adult content, but you don't ban all the kids from going in there. You, when they get to the counter, you say you can't have that.
Okay.
And by the way, there's a pronunciation thing. This is a very old joke for people like me. Is when you go to the library in the UK, you have to be really careful about the pronunciation. If you want to say, look, where's the adult book section? That's fine. But if you say, where's the adult book section? That means something completely different.
There you go.
Sorry, yeah. Adult,
that's very,
adult.
Yes,
yeah. Very esoteric.
This is helpful. Yes, okay, so we have this sort of the child provisions in the bill being driven mostly by a concern around pornography and the destructive nature of pornography in society, and it's leading to these age verification rules, which means that a lot of personal data is going to be collected around age verification here. That balance is something it's generally seen as reasonable to strike.
There is, I think, again, and there's concerns about how do you do this in a privacy safe way and who's going to do it, and I think those are technically surmountable. Yeah. And I think, in a sense, they're more straightforward questions. And again, Ofcom will decide what's acceptable or not in terms of those systems. But I think those are more straightforward questions than these other ones, which is like, how comfortable are we with mass scale network level blocking, and what about mixed use sites? I think those are more challenging in a sense than the technical question of what's the right kind of measure.
It seems that also would be a difference with the DSA, right? Because in the DSA, that is not covered in the same way.
Yeah, I don't think they have the same position. And again, once you cross the channel, the balance of privacy versus security shifts. I mean, there's a much stronger weight on privacy. I understand that. I think measures where you're collecting lots of data will receive, candidly, more scrutiny on the other side of the channel than they will do in the UK. Yes. And there are people in the UK who are very exercised about this, but I think...
And there are also different views of pornography and other kinds of content. As you said earlier, the content, the sort of content laws are not uniformly...
That's right. I do remember one of my colleagues at Facebook getting hauled before the European Parliament with complaints about why the service had banned pictures of hardcore pornography from Denmark, I think it was. And it was a Danish MEP who was
very angry,
on the barricades, like, get rid of it. Well, you wouldn't get that in the UK.
No, doesn't seem very likely.
Yeah. and then the other piece of age verification, which I think is again really interesting and is unresolved or not fully worked through, is the government is saying they really want all the social media platforms to enforce their minimum ages, which are mostly around 13 at the moment.
Because of the Children's Online Protection Act in the US.
No, I mean, it's just here. I think there's a general view that social media is damaging for kids.
Oh, but the 13-year age.
The 13-year age limit is it's GDPR, and again, I think there's misunderstanding.
But COPPA existed before.
COPPA existed before, but in GDPR, there are different age limits in different countries. The UK chose 13. All that means is actually if kids are under the age of 13, they should have parental consent.
Yes.
Now, what's actually happening today is, Ofcom produced the figures, 60% of 8 to 11-year-olds have a social media profile.
Yeah.
And I would argue that the vast majority of those are doing it with parental consent because the parent bought the phone and gave it to them and actually has supervised their access. But they've registered as an over 13-year-old because they wouldn't get through the gate otherwise. And so the question is, look, if the government's going to say we want to get really tough, and if your minimum age is 13, you must enforce it and prove to the regulator you're enforcing it. Like, for me, the natural consequence of that is we should be saying, well, two things. Either kids under 13 should not have mobile phones. Logically defensible, I think completely unrealistic. Or we need to think hard about what the services we want to have available for under 13s look like.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm willing to be challenged, but I think that the large platforms, I think, a TikTok can make a safe TikTok for a 10-year-old, and Instagram can make a safe Instagram for a 10-year-old if they know that they're 10, if everybody's honest and open about it, and they've got parental consent.
Yeah.
I think that's probably a pretty reasonable outcome, but we're not hearing that. We're kind of hearing this, just kick all the kids off. And it's like, so you leave the kids with phones, and but you're kicking them off all the mainstream services.
Where do they then end up? They end up with services that are far from mainstream. That's an interesting point.
They would, or I think what will happen is now, again, you've put friction in place. You haven't actually stopped the thing. That the parent is now going to lie more profoundly because, if the parent's willing to have the child on there, again, I mean, there are different groups. There are subsets of parents who don't want their kids on there at all. But I think there's a much larger group of parents who believe in sort of responsible internet use, are comfortable with their kids being introduced early on. And also this is how
a lot of the kids actually interact. It's exactly. a huge part of their social lives.
Yeah. I did. My kids went on school trips. If my kids are going on a school trip, they have to have WhatsApp because that's how you organise and keep everyone safe on the school trip.
Yes.
And so the idea, candidly, I would rather my child has the service that allows them to stay safe.
Yeah.
And I'm prepared to sign them up for that service than have them kicked off. So what I want is exactly that. I mean, my kid's a bit older now, but as a parent, I would want a safe service where I've given consent, where maybe I've got controls, I can view all the contacts of my kids, all that sort of stuff. That's what I want. I want those, smart, well-organised, very experienced internet service providers to give me that. I don't want them creating a desert for under 13s. But that, as I say, it's really hard to argue that in a political context. It's like, you want the kids doing the crack cocaine of social media at the age of 10. And it's like, they've got the phones, and I don't think we're going backwards.
No, we're not. We're absolutely not. Which is another question. So we have the children provisions. We have talked a little bit about what happened with the scope of the legislation. But in addition to this, at a fairly late stage, there was this push to also put criminal liability in place. So let's talk about that, because that might affect the scope, I feel.
Yeah. So it was, again, it's interesting in the debate. Once you've got past the sort of adult rated stuff in the debate, if you listen to it, the laws debate, you'll hear some contributions from people who genuinely believe that the people who run tech companies are evil. And our listeners might have some of them may take issue with that, some of them may agree with it. And so their view is that these people are venal, they're only interested in money, and the only thing that they're scared of is going to prison, and therefore we've got to put measures in place. Otherwise, they won't do what's in the bill. I actually fundamentally disagree with that. I think that once you have to do all of this work and demonstrate all this stuff to a regulator, most serious companies will change their behaviour. I think these laws, the Online Safety Bill and the Digital Services Act, will change behaviour.
Yeah,
whether or not you've got these sanctions in place, because you are law abiding. You've got lawyers that tell you must do this,
and there are also fines attached that don't necessarily have criminal liability for individuals there. And but I do wonder how it will affect. So let's talk about the construction of criminal liability here. When would it be triggered?
Well, so that's the thing. So we had a debate around this, and I certainly had strong views on it. That in the last version of the bill, it said if the regulator Ofcom comes and says, I want information about what you're doing with terrorist content, for example. And if you said to Ofcom, screw you, I'm not talking to you, or then you could be personally liable because you'd refuse to cooperate. Or if you said,
but who? If we're sort of talking about
the person who received the request.
So if I address the request to somebody who is the social media manager on the floor,
and again, I think there's a general principle of reasonableness if this ever came to court. But I think if Ofcom demonstrated they sent a letter to the head of terrorist content at Meta And the head of terrorist content had gone.
The head of okay.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah,
Yes.
counter-terrorism. Yes, sorry,
that seems better.
whatever.
Yes.
And they're expected either to provide the information or to say, I can't, but here's another person at Meta that can. So it'd be reasonable. But if they just sort of said, we're not going to talk to you, or they sent information that was deliberately false.
Yes.
They said, we haven't got any terrorist content. All right. That person, the person who received the request, is liable. So they either need to answer the request or they need to find someone who can answer the request, and they need to do it truthfully. Or they could, again, courts are reasonable, they could demonstrate that nobody has the information, if they can. But again, I don't think Ofcom's going to make an unreasonable request. They're going to ask about something they know someone has to the right person, and that person, as I say, I find it inconceivable that anyone from a major company will screw
quite
up
the
on
contrary. No, they would like to get back as soon as possible if they could. I think.
Exactly, but I think smaller companies, the ones who don't believe in regulation, some of them may just ignore that, and then they will end up liable. And Ofcom will. This is a stick they've got to say, we sent a letter to person X at this company that we can identify as being responsible for X-Chan or whatever, some service that's sort of offshore, and they didn't respond, and therefore now they're in jeopardy in the British court. Now, how enforceable that is
depends on if they ever come to.
Yeah, but from a point of view of a stick that they can use to beat the company, that works. So that was the original version. The person who was asked for information, who refused to provide it or lied.
Yeah.
Now, the version that was then debated in the House of Commons at the other end was to say that you could make liable executives for failures to comply with the duty of care towards children. So this is the duty to keep children safe. And I objected to that, because I think that the duty of care itself is very broad and quite ill-defined. It will need to be defined. So the whole process of Ofcom's engagement with companies is a process of saying, what have you done? Is that good enough? Backwards and forwards, trying to work out at what point do you think they've met the duty of care. And so there was a risk that somebody would say, this happened, I think they've not met the duty of care, I'm going to go to court and I'm going to ask the judge to prosecute that executive for failing to meet the duty of care. And this could be running in parallel with the Ofcom regulatory process, and the judge and Ofcom might come to different views. I mean, a lot of British judges would say, look, I'll defer to Ofcom, but you've still got, potentially this sort of
conflict between different institutions.
Both trying to say, did that executive meet the duty of care? Now the government hasn't given us the final version, but I think they've moved to a place which, personally, I think is much more sensible, which says, look, the way it works is company has to do the risk assessment, provide the information, goes to Ofcom. Ofcom looks at what they say they're doing. They decide whether or not they met the duty of care. If Ofcom thinks that they're failing in any respect, Ofcom has all sorts of powers in the bill to give directions. So the company may say, we've looked at it, we don't think we need to scan for self-harm content because we think it's all fine and there isn't enough. And Ofcom may say, no, that's wrong. You have to have a team dedicated to removing self-harm content because the risk assessment shows the risk is too high. If you refuse to do it voluntarily, we give you a direction. Company X, have a team, find self-harm content. Now that direction will come to an executive in the company. It'll come to somebody who's powerful enough to make it happen. So the new version, I think, will say, look, if that person on receipt of the direction says, screw you, Ofcom, then they can make themselves liable. And they use some language around sort of consenting, conniving. And again, I can see that sort of makes sense. The regulator has told you, do something. And if you...
it would be true for many other sectors too, where you can become criminally liable for not cleaning up, for example, an environmental spill or something
having been
that,
ordered
right?
to do it.
Yeah.
And the advantage of this is from a prosecution point of view, going to court to try and prove whether somebody met a duty of care, very broad thing, hard.
Yeah.
And who was responsible, hard. Ofcom's issued a direction. The direction has gone to Mr. Nicklas Lundblad, Google Towers, you know, and they know who it's gone to. They know what it said, and you can test, as a matter of fact, did they do the thing?
Yeah.
I told them to put in place this team. Did they do it? I can ask for the decision-making process internally and see whether...
As a part of the discovery
process.
Yeah,
did this person say... you know, minute, screw Ofcom, we're not doing it, you know. And if that minute exists and they didn't do the thing, well, you know.
And it also has the advantage of the broader duty of care provision, or that way of framing it, would obviously have an impact on, again, what we spoke about before, the scope of the legislation and the amount of content taken down. Because if I know that there is somewhere in this duty of care, there's sort of lurking a criminal liability, I might just say, oh, that looks bad, let's take it all down. So narrowing the criminal liability to this very particular process might also have the merit of narrowing the scope of the legislation.
Exactly. You will know the point at which you've become in jeopardy. And while you're in this process of working with Ofcom to define...
It's also a safe harbour, where sort of you have the benefit of the doubt as long as you're negotiating in good faith.
In good faith, and you're trying to do the right thing, which I think is right. And this perhaps is maybe the biggest area where I think the bill potentially is going to... Yeah, it's going to be really hard. Like, content moderation is hard.
It is very hard.
It involves trade-offs and judgments.
Yes.
And whenever you have trade-offs and judgments, people will come to different views. And I think, like, Ofcom's view about whether the trade-off or judgment that a company has made is right should be the supreme view. That's the way you get the clarity. The clarity is Parliament says to Ofcom, we want you to moderate the platforms for these things. We want you to regulate the platforms and make sure they're doing these things. Ofcom then says, right, let's translate that into detail. We've been told we need to make sure you're dealing with self-harm content for kids. You've told us what you're doing, and we've said that's good enough. You're catching 95% of bad content of type X. We, Ofcom, are happy. Now, someone else is going to say, look, no, I think they should have caught 98%. Or somebody else is going to say, look, by catching 95%, they've also caught some stuff that they shouldn't have. And because of freedom of expression, I think they should change it and only catch 85%. Because that way we protect more good content. And those people are all going to have different views. And that's fine, and Ofcom should listen to them. But what you don't want is 3 different standards. No. And we've got to avoid creating those scenarios. But I think Ofcom is going to be left in the position that the platforms are in today, where they're constantly disappointing people who make a different judgment, who either want them to be more aggressive or they want them to be more permissive. Yeah. But Ofcom has to be given the scope to define the line, and we as politicians have to defend Ofcom when they have defined the line, and we mustn't create a whole bunch of mechanisms where we second guess them and create alternative visions. And there is a risk of that, I think, a little bit with the legislation.
So let's do the ultimate test then. Let's say this something close to this becomes law. It passes through the process. It is enacted. Ofcom takes its role. Fast forward to 2030.
Yeah.
You're looking at this and you say, it was a pretty darn good bill. It was very successful. I think it should be held up as an example for how to do this kind of regulation. What will you be looking at? And conversely, you look back from 2030 and say, that was a huge waste of time, and it also led to some pretty bad outcomes. What would you be looking for to assess the success or failure of the bill?
Yeah. So for me, success is that you've continued to make incremental improvements in the safety of online services. So it's the outcome. Like, our users, our citizens in the United Kingdom, do they feel safer online? Do they have a better online experience? That's really what it's all about. More of the good stuff, less of the bad stuff, and however they define that. So the test, I think, and the real test should be, and we should be asking them, a panel of UK citizens every year, how do they feel it's going? And I think it is about incremental improvement. Again, one of the analogies I like to use is that of cars. Cars in many ways are analogous because they're all about personal freedom. We all want to get on the road and drive without asking permission. And sadly, they cause harm, that we haven't made them perfectly safe. But what we've done is incrementally make them a little bit safer every year. And we have targets to do that. Not to make them 100% safe, wanted that, they'd drive at 15 kilometers an hour and they'd all have big sort of spongy bags around them. But we make them a little bit safer every year. And I think we should be able to see that. In the same way we can see that road safety over 5 or 10 years has improved, we should be able to see that the services have improved over that sort of period of time.
But this is interesting, and in some sense what you're suggesting is that the success of a law like this is to get out of the unhealthy cycle where legislation always lags behind technological and social development and is trying to catch up. But what you say is, okay, we will not be able to catch up in legislation. We can catch up in enforcement and regulation, where where Ofcom, for example, can keep pace with both the technological development and the social development that leads to the use of these services and has an overall effect on online safety. So it's a shift of mechanism into this sort of Ofcom-led negotiation of safety rather than anything else. And if that keeps pace with the way that things are growing, then we should be good.
Yeah, and we have a spectrum of where services are, just like we had a spectrum of sort of safety in vehicles and things. You want to pull everyone into the leading edge of that. So Ofcom sets a leading edge and pulls everyone towards that. But that leading edge has to be realistic. It can't be, impossible for people to meet. And you're just pulling improvements through the whole system by, we design seatbelts and we start with them voluntary, and then at a certain point they can become mandatory because they're already in the market enough and we know how they work. So that's for me is the success, that you're pulling through safety, making incremental improvements. The failure, and I use this for speech, is cookie banners.
Yes.
Cookie banner syndrome, I've said. And there are lots of areas like this. And again, some people might like cookie banners. They were a late amendment to the e-privacy directive. So they came in. It's exactly the scenario we're in now, where someone's got a piece of legislation and they have a bright idea and they go, let's just throw this in there. And cookie banners have had almost zero effect on advertising. One decision by Apple has done more to restrict online behavioral advertising than all of those millions of banners that are out there. They've cost hundreds of millions of euros, and at worst they're a mild irritant, and at best they're a mild irritant, and at worst they've trained a generation of people to click through.
Or there's security risk.
Yeah, the security risk. You just train people to click. So I think, and again, it's hard for legislators sometimes to accept it, but you just need to look at it and go, that was a failure. Like, if we wanted to ban online behavioral advertising, we should have banned it, or talked to Apple sooner and got them to do it. In fact, the other version was to do it in browser controls. And now we look at it, that would have been so much better. But anyway, that's the risk. And I can see in a number of these areas in the online safety bill. So age verification is one. It could be done well. Age assurance, there are different ways of doing this. You could do this really well. You could assign people to the right age groups. You could end up with a much safer internet, people getting the right services. You could do it really badly, where it's like cookie banners and it's expensive and it's full of friction and changes nothing. So all the 10-year-olds now just appear to be 18-year-olds, having gone through some process like that. That is a major error. There's one area in the bill which I'm skeptical of. I will say it, I'll have to say it in the debate, but there's this whole idea of content controls. So the part of the deal was, we're not going to deal with this legal but harmful stuff. So if it's legal, you can keep it on the platform, but you must have controls so the user can decide whether or not to see it. I have a lot of questions around whether or not that's going to be
It's an old idea to push the controls to the edge. We've talked about this before, the early pick standard, the idea that the user can control. It's not entirely bad. The problem is that when you mandate them, you really create a ceiling rather than a floor. So I think some users would ask for this merely for commercial reasons. And, it would be demand driven. It would be great for me to have the ability to scale down a little bit of this content and scale up a little bit of that content. But I think when you mandate it, what you do is you create this ceiling where there's going to be a clunky set of possible cookie banners.
Exactly, and that's it. Yeah. So if done well, in response to what users actually want, fine. But let's start with what users actually want. Whereas at the moment we're sitting there theoretically going, I think, and again, candidly, politicians are really atypical, and the reason politicians are atypical is because they get constant abuse. So they're a lot drawing on their own experience, which is an awful experience. But I go online, it's full of abuse. Like, most normal people they go online, their news feed is not full of terrible abuse. You know, if they like fishing, it's full of fishing stuff. If they like, you know, swimming, it's full of swimming stuff. So that there's this atypical thing. So this idea that the person who has no problem at all with their feed is now suddenly going to be asked to go through a bunch of controls to say, do you want to stop the hate speech you weren't getting anyway? That's what I mean by cookie banner syndrome. And if we stick stuff in there rather than saying, Ofcom, look at this, Ofcom, go away and look at what kind of content controls people would actually want and use versus ones that they would just find irritating and getting in the way, fine. But I've got a little bit, because just from the debate already, that it's like, no, we've got to insist and we've got to almost design it in the legislation. So that's the other area.
It's interesting. So when do you think the bill will actually hit the books?
So the way that the UK system works is you've got to get through in a thing called a parliamentary session. And sessions are, like everything in the UK, it's movable feast. And we thought we were going to run out in May when the king is crowned, but now they've extended it to September. They could just extend it. It's like, whatever, you know. And so they've extended it to September, partly to allow this legislation, others to get through. So I think it'll be done by July. So it'll be on the statute book. And as people keep saying, that's when the real work starts, because that's the legislation, the framework.
Yeah.
Then under the framework, that will now empower Ofcom, the regulator, to start drawing up specific codes of practice and all of the detailed instructions. So we by July will be instructing Ofcom to draw up the instructions that it's going to give to the platforms. And then there's a sort of bedding in period over a year or two. There'll be some pressure. I think candidly, you know, understanding the full duty of care stuff is going to take time, because you've got to get the risk assessments in and look at them before you can know what you're going to tell the platforms to do. The area where there'll be the biggest pressure is the back to often pornography. There'll be a lot of, because we've had this law that's not implemented for years, I think there'll be a lot of pressure to say, let's get in the 18-year-old age gate like as soon as it's law, which means addressing those hard problems that I described.
And what advice would you give to platforms now? Should they start looking now at the terms of services? Should they wait? Should they reach out to Ofcom? How should they think about? Because obviously, just sitting around and waiting is probably not a good way to address something like this, right?
No, I would absolutely, I would role play. If I was working at a platform now, I would role play. I would do my risk assessments, because I think they're good, and I think they've got a lot of this actually anyway, but I would pull my risk assessments together, looking at all the major areas in the bill: terrorism, hate speech, financial fraud, child abuse, all of that stuff. So I would do my model risk assessments, and I would get a bunch of people in, probably externally, but probably my lawyers actually would be my outside counsel in this case, and they would get a lot of money for this, but there you go, that's a nice job if you can get it. And I would get them in, and I would present my risk assessment, and I would be presenting my plan to deal with it, and I would be testing, you know, does it pass the laugh test? You know, does it sound like I'm doing something reasonable, or when I'm actually sitting down across the table with Ofcom, are they going to look at me and go, what, is that all you've got? You know,
and would you do that particularly for the Ofcom audience, or would you also go to your users and see what is it that they want? Because at some point you could argue that a lot of the safety improvements in cars over the years have actually been because people don't want to die in cars. There's demand for a safer car. So how do you balance? Because at one point you could say, look, there's a lot of stuff people would want from these platforms in terms of how they evolve over time, and you could look at safety and security measures they want, and then you can look at the legislation and see where there's a little bit of overlap there, perhaps.
I think the test is what does the regulator want, and what will the users accept? And again, if we think about the car thing, if you'd said to the users, do you want to have seatbelts and stop drink driving and all of those things, I think you would have a lot of users who would have said no. So what you had to do was, you know, the regulator wanted you to do the seatbelt thing, and then you have to get it to a certain level of acceptance amongst your users. But you are doing it, again, if we're really honest, often you're doing things to your users, and hopefully with them over time, but often they won't be leading in terms of asking for things that will almost always make their lives a little bit more frictionful, even if it makes them safer. So you're right. It's a really interesting question. I think what you do want to do, though, and this is going to be hard, but to be really honest about if the regulator looks like they want you to do something that your users will really hate and will actually make the thing unusable, how do you communicate that? You can't be crying wolf. You can't be, if it's just a little bit difficult and annoying, you can't say, oh, we fit seatbelts, we'll never sell a car again.
Yes.
But there may be some things, you make all the cars go at 15 miles an hour and have foam bumpers. Yes, at that point, maybe that's what the regulator wanted you to do. You would have an argument to say, look, I'm never going to sell a car again. Yeah. So it's that balance of not crying wolf, but genuinely communicating. If you think the regulator is asking you for a cookie banner,
yes,
telling you to do something that will be expensive and useless.
Best case, useless.
Best case, useless.
Yes.
Worst case,
excellent.
Harmful.
Well, thank you. This is brilliant. And I think we will close up with that. And you can find this podcast on your website, which is
www.regulate.tech. And I hope I've been doing a better job of integrating the podcast. I've been playing with some plugins. So I think they now appear as posts.
Excellent.
But we're on Spotify, aren't we? We're all over the place.
Yes, we are. And as soon as I figure out their submission system, we'll be on Apple Podcasts too. Very, very good. Well, thank you so much. Tune in and listen to us next time because we're off to a new year and I am pretty sure there won't be less tech policy to talk about.